You were sitting in your car. The engine was off. You had been home for maybe 10 minutes, but you had not gone inside yet. The porch light was on. You could see it through the windshield. You just sat there. Nothing dramatic had happened that night. You had dinner with people you have known for years. The food was fine. The conversation moved the way it always does. No one said anything cruel. No one left early. On the surface, it was a normal evening. But driving home, somewhere around the third traffic light, something in your chest went very quiet. Not sad exactly, not angry, just quiet. The kind of quiet that tells you something is being processed that your words are not ready for yet. You sat in that car and you did not know what to name it. The window fogged a little from your breath. You looked down at your phone, not to check anything, just because you did not know where else to look. And then you sat with that feeling for another few minutes. The feeling that you had spent the entire evening being present for everyone in that room, except yourself. That is where this starts. Not with a betrayal, not with a fight, not with someone showing you who they really are in one dramatic moment. It starts with a Tuesday night in November, in a parked car, and a question you could not quite form yet. Something had shifted. You were not sure when, but something was different, and the effort of pretending otherwise was getting heavier every time. For a long time, you explained it away. You told yourself you were tired. You told yourself it was seasonal, hormonal, situational. You told yourself everyone goes through phases where connection feels harder to access. You read something once about introversion and decided that was probably it. You said, "I've just been in my head lately." You said, "I need to be better about showing up." You said, "They have a lot going on, I should be more patient." Maybe I'm expecting too much. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I'm not trying hard enough. Maybe I'm trying too hard, and that's why it feels hollow. Maybe this is just what adult friendship looks like, and I romanticized it. Maybe the problem is me. You cycled through all of it. And here is the thing about that cycle. It is not evidence that you were wrong to doubt yourself. Checking yourself is honest. Asking whether you are the problem is what thoughtful people do. That is not weakness. But there is a difference between checking yourself once and building a permanent residence in self-questioning, because staying in that question is the only way to avoid an answer you are not ready to face. At some point, the question, "Am I overthinking this?" became a way to stop looking at what was actually in front of you. You were not overthinking. You were delaying. Here is what was actually there. It was not a villain. No one in this story needs to be a monster for the truth to be real. That is the part that makes it complicated, because we are good at handling clear wrongdoing. What we are not good at is the texture of something that looks fine on the outside, but leaves you feeling diminished every time. They were kind when they needed something from you, warm when the conversation was about their life, present when your energy was useful to have in the room. But when you brought something heavy, the conversation would somehow drift. Not rudely, just drift. You would start saying something real, and by the end of the exchange, you were somehow reassuring them about their reaction to your pain. You had gotten very good at that. When you needed clarity on something that mattered, the response would come back vague or delayed or redirected, and you learned over time not to push. Pushing felt like being difficult, so you didn't push. They apologized sometimes, and the apologies were real enough that you held on to them, but the behavior would circle back. Not always loudly, sometimes just a tone, a timing, a choice about what to mention and what to leave out. You would feel the familiar tightness in your chest, and you would think, "Here we go again," and then tell yourself you were being uncharitable. Some people do not know they do this. That is true, and it matters. Recognizing a pattern is not the same as assigning malice. But here is the other thing that is also true. The impact lands the same either way. You can love someone genuinely and still make them smaller with how you move through a relationship. You can mean well and still only soften when someone starts pulling away. You notice that part. You always notice that part. When you went quiet, when you stopped initiating, when you gave just a little less energy, they would suddenly become more available, warmer, more attentive. And you would think maybe I was imagining it, and you would lean back in, and a few weeks later you would be parked in your car again wondering why the evening felt so hollow. But there is a part of this I want to sit with for a moment, because I think it deserves more than just a quick acknowledgement. There was a part of you that still wanted to believe. Not naively, not blindly. The part of you that wanted to believe was not the same part that ignored the signs. They are two different things. The part that wanted to believe was the part that remembered when things were easier, when there was a version of that connection that felt real, when you laughed without calculating, when you could say something unfinished and they would not look at you like you were too much. You wanted to get back to that. And so you kept adjusting, kept softening, kept showing up with a slightly different version of yourself, hoping that this time the equation would work. You are not stupid for that. The part of you that stayed longer than maybe you should have was not operating out of weakness. It was operating out of grief. It was trying to avoid the mourning that comes with admitting something you once had is not there anymore. Because once you say that out loud, you have to feel it. And feeling it means accepting that some of the time you spent trying to protect that connection was time you could not get back. That is hard. It is supposed to be hard. Letting go of something that was real at some point, even if it stopped being real, is one of the heaviest things we do as humans. You were not holding on out of weakness. You were holding on because you were not ready to grieve yet. That is allowed. Your body already knew, though. Not in a mystical way, in a very ordinary, practical, physical way. There are people in your life who you can spend 3 hours with and drive home feeling more like yourself. And there are people you can spend 45 minutes with and feel like you need 2 days to recover. That is real information. That is not a personality flaw in you. That is data. You had been overriding that data for a long time. You would feel the tension in your shoulders in the car on the way to meet them. Not because anything bad had happened yet, just because your nervous system was already preparing for the work of managing the room. You would end a phone call and realize you had spent the whole conversation just slightly braced, not fully present, but holding just enough of yourself back to protect the part of you that tends to get smaller in that exchange. You slept heavier on the nights you did not respond to a message right away. The evenings where you stayed home and did not fill the silence with someone else's noise. There was a physical relaxation in your body that was hard to ignore once you noticed it. Your body was not confused. Your body had been reading the frequency of those interactions for much longer than your mind was willing to admit. That is not paranoia. Paranoia is pattern building from fear without evidence. This was evidence without a narrative yet. You had years of small moments stored somewhere below the level of conscious thought, and your body was doing the math, even when your brain was still finding reasons to explain it away. There is something worth trusting in that, not blindly, not as a reason to be suspicious of everyone, but when the same reaction happens again and again, in different contexts, at different times of day, under different circumstances, and it keeps pointing to the same thing, that is not your anxiety making things up. That is your system trying to tell you something consistent. You already knew. You just needed to stop calling that knowledge a problem. And then one day you just stopped. Not dramatically. There was no confrontation, no speech, no list of grievances delivered with perfect clarity. You did not say the thing you had rehearsed 100 times in the shower. You did not send the message that explained everything. You just stopped initiating. You stopped being the one to suggest plans, Stop being the one to follow up on a conversation that ended awkwardly. Stop sending the check-in text you had been sending out of obligation more than genuine wanting. And then you waited to see what happened. Some of them reached out, some of them did not. Some of them sent a message months later that made you realize they had not actually noticed. And none of that was as devastating as you thought it would be, because by the time you saw the answer, you had already suspected it. You did not announce an ending. You did not need to. You just stopped volunteering for something that kept asking you to be smaller. This is a different kind of courage than people talk about. It does not look like standing up in a room and speaking your truth. It looks like not going back. It looks like not sending the explanation they would not hear anyway. It looks like letting the silence do the work you kept trying to do with words. There is a kind of dignity in that, a quiet one. The kind no one else will applaud because no one else can see it. But you will know it happened. And in the place where you used to feel that low-grade pull to explain yourself, to make them understand, to get them to finally see it, that pull went quiet. Not because you stopped caring, because you stopped needing their version of events to validate your own. Something shifted after that. Not all at once, not in a movie montage way where everything suddenly got better, but in small, accumulative ways that you started to notice after a few weeks. You stopped checking your phone as often in the morning. That specific anxiety, the one where you wake up and immediately reach for the device to see if something happened, something you need to respond to, something that requires you to manage a feeling before you have even had coffee. That started to fade. You had more thoughts that were fully your own. That sounds strange to say, but it is true. When you spend a lot of time calibrating to someone else's energy, a lot of your mental bandwidth goes toward tracking them. Where are they? What are they feeling? What do I need to do or not do to keep this comfortable? When that stops, there is this open space in your head that is sometimes unsettling at first, because you do not know what to do with quiet, and then gradually becomes something else. Room. You started noticing what you actually wanted more clearly. Not what was expected of you, not what would keep things smooth, but what you genuinely wanted from an hour of time alone, from a conversation, from a weekend. That clarity is harder to access than it sounds when you have been in a long habit of reshaping yourself to fit a space that was not built for the full version of you. You did not need them to admit anything. That is the part that surprised you most. You had spent so much energy, so much careful thought, building the case in your mind for why you were right, and they needed to see it. And somewhere in the process of stepping back, you realize you did not actually need the verdict. The feeling of being right did not matter as much as the feeling of being still. That is not indifference. That is something harder to get to. I want to say something about the spiritual dimension of this, because I think it gets said in ways that can feel manipulative if you are not careful. And I want to try to say it plainly. There are versions of this conversation where someone tells you that everyone who left your life was an enemy, that God was protecting you from predators, that the co-isolation was proof of your special assignment. And sometimes people need to hear that framing to give themselves permission to stop fighting for connections that were exhausting them. I understand why it exists, but I think there is something more honest and more lasting available here. Maybe the point was not that those people were dangerous. Maybe the point was that you had learned, over a long period of time, to make yourself fit into spaces that did not fit you. And the discomfort of the isolation, the painful stillness of having fewer people around, was the only condition under which you were finally forced to stop adjusting and just be still long enough to hear yourself. Not because Chua was punishing the people who left, not because you were being hidden from enemies, but because you had gotten very good at being whoever the room needed, and the only way to stop that was to be in a room that was mostly empty. The spiritual meaning of isolation is not always warfare. Sometimes it is correction. Not the punitive kind, the gentle, expensive kind, where you are given exactly the conditions you need to become more fully yourself. And those conditions happen to look, from the outside, like loss. The people who fell away, many of them were not placed in your life to harm you. They were placed there while you were one version of yourself. When that version changed, the connection could not hold the weight of the new frequency. That is not a conspiracy. It is just what happens when anything grows. Not everything from the old life can travel into the next chapter. That does not make the old connections meaningless. It means they were real for the season they existed in. And it means the season changed. You are not being punished by the quiet. You are being given the one thing that is hard to access inside the noise. Enough silence to finally hear what you actually think, what you actually want, what you are actually willing to carry. That is not a small gift, even when it hurts. You do not have to rush any of this. You do not have to build a new circle immediately to prove that the old one was fine to leave. You do not have to have a neat story ready for anyone who asks. You do not have to perform healing on a timeline that makes other people comfortable. Some days you will miss specific people from your old life, and it will not feel like a mistake to miss them. That is allowed. Missing someone is not the same as being wrong about what you felt. Grief is not a sign that you made the wrong choice. You can grieve a connection that was also genuinely not good for you. Those things are not opposites. You will know the new people when they arrive, not because they will be perfect, but because you will not have to recover from spending time with them. You will not be braced around them. You will say something unfinished, and they will stay with it instead of redirecting. They will exist on the side of you that you had been suppressing to fit somewhere else. They are coming, not as a reward, not as proof that you were right, just because you are moving toward people whose frequency you can actually hear now. Until then, you do not have to fill the space. The space is doing something. If this conversation has been sitting somewhere true for you, drop a comment, something small. I trust what I felt, or I stopped explaining it away, or just I heard myself this time. Not for anyone else, just as a marker for you. A small note that says you were here, and something in you recognized something real today. If you want more of this, not motivational, not loud, just honest, subscribe. Share this with whoever in your life is currently calling themselves an overthinker, when actually they are just someone waking up to something they already knew. And this, before you go, may you stop calling your intuition a problem just because it noticed what your heart was not ready to name. The quiet is not empty. It is the first honest space you have had in a long time.